She had learned, early and without ceremony, that life did not distribute its difficulties evenly. Some people moved through the world with a kind of effortless forward motion, one good thing leading naturally to another, setbacks absorbed and forgotten before they had the chance to leave marks. Nora had not been one of those people. She had known from a young age what it meant to hold something tightly, not because it was precious, but because letting go meant having nothing at all. She was 38 years old and lived in a rented house on the eastern edge of a mid-sized town that had once been industrial and was now just tired. The neighborhood had the particular quality of a place that had stopped trying to become anything other than what it already was. Houses sat close together on narrow lots, or their lawns more dirt than grass in summer, their gutters full of leaves that no one got around to clearing. It was the kind of street where people knew each other not from choice, but from proximity, where the walls between lives were thin enough to hear arguments and laughter and the particular silence that followed both. She worked 2 jobs. The first was at a medical billing company downtown, a position that required her to sit at a desk for 8 hours and translate the language of illness into numbers that insurance companies could process or deny. It was not work that filled her with any particular feeling other than the steady satisfaction of competence. She was good at it. She was precise and patient and rarely made errors, qualities that her supervisor appreciated without ever quite acknowledging. The second job was 3 evenings a week at a grocery store 4 blocks from her house, stocking shelves in the hours when the building was quiet and the fluorescent lights buzzed without apology above her head. She had worked that shift for 2 years without missing a single one. Her daughter, Lily, was 9. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, though the man himself had been gone for 6 years and was rarely mentioned. He had left during a period when things were at their most difficult, which was either a coincidence or a character revelation, depending on how charitable you felt toward him on any given day. Nora had stopped trying to decide which it was. What mattered was that Lily was here, and healthy, and doing well enough in school that her teacher had used the word bright in the last parent conference, a word that Nora had carried home quietly and set somewhere inside herself like a candle she intended to keep burning. The bills were the constant backdrop of their life together, not catastrophic in any single moment, but relentless in aggregate. The rent was not quite manageable. The car needed something every 3 months, always something different, always something necessary. Lily had outgrown her shoes twice in 1 year. The heating bill in February had been a thing Nora had stared at on the kitchen table for a long time before she allowed herself to begin calculating. There were no savings to speak of. There was a checking account that ended each month with a number that required careful optimism to interpret as stability rather than precarity. She did not complain about any of it. Not to her co-workers, not to her neighbors, so not to the few friends she still had time to see. Complaining had never struck her as particularly useful, and she had learned long ago that sympathy was a finite resource that people rationed carefully. She was not interested in drawing it out of anyone who might need it later for something worse. She got through each week by maintaining a kind of deliberate forward momentum, one task followed by another, each day completed and set aside, each small obligation met with the quiet discipline of someone who understood that survival wasn't passive. It was on a Tuesday in early October that the call came. She was at her desk at the billing company, working through a stack of claims that had been returned for resubmission. Her phone showed a number she did not recognize, a different area code, somewhere south, but she almost let it go to voicemail. She answered on the third ring out of a habit she could not fully explain, the same instinct that made her always check under the bed when she heard a sound at night, even though she never found anything. The voice on the other end was formal and measured, a man who introduced himself as an attorney, a name she did not catch clearly, but didn't ask him to repeat. He said he was calling on behalf of the estate of Harold Beaumont, and he paused there as though the name would register with some weight. It did after a moment. Harold Beaumont was her great-uncle. He was the eldest brother of her maternal grandmother, which made him a peripheral figure in her family's story, and present mainly in the margins of old photographs and referenced occasionally at the kinds of gatherings that happened only when someone died. He had been a quiet man, by all accounts, a man who had spent his life in the rural county where he was born and had never seen any particular reason to leave it. He had never married. He had built something there, some combination of land and patience, and whatever it is that accumulates in a person's life when they stay in one place long enough to become part of it. He had died at 83, the attorney said, 11 days ago. The estate was now in the process of being settled. Nora had attended the funeral, and she had driven 4 hours with Lily sleeping in the back seat, and had stood at the graveside in the cold, thin light of an October morning, surrounded by relatives she recognized, but did not know well. Harold had been civil to her in the few interactions they'd shared over the years. Not warm exactly, but not dismissive either. He had asked about Lily once by name, and she had been surprised that he knew it. The attorney was explaining now that she had been named in the will. He used careful language, the language of a man accustomed to delivering news that could be received in many different ways. He said that all beneficiaries were being notified individually, and that a formal reading would take place the following Saturday at the family home. He asked if she could attend. She said yes without thinking through the logistics, and then spent the rest of the afternoon quietly working out how she would manage the drive, Lily's school schedule, and the shelf-stocking shift she would need to call in sick for. She told no one at work. She said nothing to Lily until Thursday evening, when she explained simply that they would be taking a trip on the weekend to visit the family, and that there was a legal matter to attend to. Lily accepted this with the practical acceptance of a child who had grown accustomed to her mother handling things without much fanfare. They drove down Saturday morning, leaving before 7 to avoid what little traffic the highway offered. The landscape shifted gradually as they went south, the tight grid of the city giving way to wider roads and longer spaces between things, the sky opening up in a way that always made Nora feel slightly exposed, as if the absence of buildings left too much room for thoughts she usually kept moving. Lily sat in the back seat with a book and asked questions at intervals, mostly about how long until they arrived, and whether they would eat before or after the reading. The Beaumont property sat at the end of a gravel road that the county had apparently decided was not worth paving. The house was large by any ordinary measure, a 2-story wooden structure with a wide porch that had once been white and was now somewhere between cream and gray. It sat on land that stretched out in all directions, flat in some places, gently rolling in others, bordered by old fence lines and a tree line to the south that the afternoon light turned dark and still. Cars were already parked along the drive when they arrived. Nora recognized some of them. There were cousins she had not seen in years, an aunt who had aged in ways that seemed concentrated around her eyes, a cluster of relatives from Harold's side of the family that she had never managed to properly sort into memory. The gathering had the particular atmosphere of family obligation performed under strain. People who had driven significant distances and were holding themselves together with the effort of appearing appropriately somber, while also being acutely, privately aware of what was at stake. She found a space for the car near the fence and walked Lily to the house. A woman she identified as Harold's distant cousin handed them both glasses of sweet tea without asking if they wanted it, and directed them toward the living room with the confidence of someone who had appointed herself host without anyone necessarily agreeing. And the room filled slowly. The attorney stood at the front near the fireplace, a thin man in a gray suit who looked like he had given this particular performance many times and had developed a professional neutrality around it that served him well. He waited until the chairs were occupied and the conversations had tapered into cautious quiet before he opened the folder he had brought and began. Harold Beaumont had accumulated more than most people in that county expected of a man who had lived quietly and without ostentation. There was the house and the land, which together represented the majority of the estate's value. There was a savings account that had grown slowly and steadily over decades into a number that produced visible reactions in the room when it was read aloud. There were vehicles, including a truck that still ran, and various pieces of equipment and furniture, and the small accumulations of a long life that were assigned and distributed with the methodical precision of a man who had thought carefully about all of it in advance. The house went to Harold's nearest surviving relative on his direct line, a cousin named Warren, who received the news with a controlled expression that did not quite conceal the relief beneath it. The land was divided, portions assigned to different family members, with notes attached to each allocation that reflected Harold's reasoning. The savings account was split among several people, the shares varying in ways that suggested deliberate choices rather than equal distribution. Some received more than others, and the room recalibrated itself around each announcement with the small, barely perceptible adjustments of people trying to remember that grief and money were supposed to occupy separate emotional spaces. Nora listened without speaking. Lily sat beside her, with the book closed on her lap, reading the room in the way that children sometimes do, sensing the texture of what the adults around her were feeling without being able to name it. Nora kept her face still. She had not come with expectations. She had barely come with hope. She had come because you did not ignore a call from an attorney about a family estate, and because her name had been included, and because there had been something in the attorney's careful phrasing on the phone that had made her think it might be worth the drive. When her name was read, the room shifted almost imperceptibly. My eyes moved to her in the small, involuntary way that rooms of people move toward whatever is being indicated. The attorney looked at her directly and read from the document in his folder. To Nora Beaumont Clark, Harold had left the gazebo. There was a moment of silence, brief and strange, and then someone in the back of the room made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but occupied the same territory. The attorney continued reading, clarifying that the bequest referred to the garden gazebo structure located at the southeastern boundary of the main property, along with the land parcel on which it stood, a portion totaling approximately 1/3 of an acre. The attorney did not look up from his papers as he said this. He used the same tone he had used for everything else, which made it worse somehow, the flatness of it, the absence of apology. Nora said nothing. Later, during the period when the formal portion had ended, and people were moving around with their tea and their quiet, private satisfaction or disappointment, one of the cousins, a man named Dale, who had received a generous share of the savings account and seemed energized by it, came to stand near her with the particular ease of someone who felt they had already won the most important thing the day had to offer. He said that she should look on the bright side, that at least she had gotten something. He said it with a smile that he probably believed was kind, but was actually the smile of someone who had decided in advance how this situation should make her feel, and was simply confirming that it did. She thanked him without adjusting her expression. Another relative was an older woman named Constance, who had driven up from somewhere south of there, touched Nora's arm, and said with genuine gentleness that Harold had always been a strange man about things, that no one could ever quite account for how his mind worked, that it was nothing personal. This was meant to be comforting and was not, but Nora appreciated the sincerity behind it and said nothing to complicate the offer. Lily looked up at her mother at one point and asked quietly what a gazebo was. Nora told her it was a garden structure, like a small open building meant to sit in during nice weather. Lily considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things and said that it sounded nice. Nora looked at her daughter's face, the simple and unperformed hopefulness in it, and felt something that she could not immediately categorize. Not comfort exactly. Something adjacent to it. She asked the attorney before she left whether she could see the structure before making any decisions about it. He told her that, as the new owner, she was of course free to access the property at any time, and that he would see to it that the relevant documentation was prepared. He gave her a folder with the address and a contact number for Warren, who now owned the main house, and who she would need to coordinate with regarding access through the property. She drove back to the main house's edge and looked from the car window toward the southeastern corner of the land, following the fence line with her eyes. In the fading afternoon light, she could make out something at the far end of the field, a shape that had collapsed into itself, obscured by the growth of years, barely distinguishable from the surrounding vegetation. She could not have said with confidence that it was a building at all. It looked more like the idea of a building, the memory of one, left out in the rain long enough to forget its own purpose. She drove home with Lily asleep again in the back seat and the folder on the passenger seat, and the particular silence of someone thinking through a problem they have not yet decided whether to solve. She did not tell the people at work, and she did not mention it to her neighbors, and she spent the following week in her regular routine without allowing the inheritance to occupy more space than it deserved, which she had tentatively decided was not very much. 1/3 of an acre of land at the edge of someone else's property, with a collapsed structure on it, in a county 4 hours from her home. She tried to think of it in practical terms. Land had value in principle. But land with a ruined building on it, accessed by a gravel road, in an area where the market for anything was more theoretical than immediate, land like that required a kind of optimism she was not sure she could justify. And yet she drove back the following Saturday. She told herself it was because she needed to see it properly, in daylight, to have a basis for whatever decision she eventually made. That was the rational explanation. The less rational one was something she acknowledged only briefly, the possibility that Harold had included her for a reason, that a man who had been deliberate enough to divide his estate with such evident care might have been deliberate in this decision too, even if the logic of it was not immediately visible. She left Lily with a neighbor and drove south again under a gray sky that didn't decide whether it wanted to rain and eventually chose not to. She stopped at the main house to collect the key Warren had left for her and walked the fence line to the southeastern corner without going inside. Warren's wife had watched her from the front window with an expression that managed to be both polite and deeply skeptical, which Nora had grown accustomed to as the general ambient mood of the estate experience so far. The path to the gazebo had once been a defined walkway. She could see the ghost of it beneath the overgrowth, a slight depression in the ground that the grass had closed over but not entirely erased, and she followed it through knee-high weeds that had taken full advantage of a summer without anyone to argue with them. The trees that lined the southeastern border had grown inward over the years, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the light into something diffuse and quiet. By the time she reached the structure, she had pushed through enough vegetation that her jacket was covered in small seeds, and her boots were dark with moisture from the soil. What she found was not so much a collapsed gazebo as the aftermath of one. The roof had failed first. That much was clear from the way the debris lay. The original structure had been octagonal, she thought, though it was difficult to be certain with the boards in their current configuration. Some fallen inward, some outward, one somehow balanced against a still-standing corner post at an angle that seemed to require active defiance of physics. The wooden floor was almost entirely buried beneath years of fallen leaves and the quiet accumulation of small debris that a forest edge produced without effort. Vines had claimed most of the remaining vertical surfaces, their grip thorough and patient. She walked around the perimeter slowly, stepping carefully over collapsed sections, testing each footfall before committing to it. Up close, the wood showed its age in the particular way of outdoor structures left without maintenance. Darkened, soft in places, the grain raised and roughened. Some sections had held up better than expected, the lower posts in particular showing a solidity that the upper sections had lost. The corner posts were original, she suspected, at old-growth timber, the kind of dense and resinous wood that resisted rot for decades beyond what modern lumber could manage. She crouched at one corner and examined the foundation. What she had expected was a simple concrete pad, the kind of thing a gazebo usually sat on, functional and without ambition. What she found instead made her pause. The foundation was stone, not poured concrete, but cut and laid stone, each piece fitted with a care that was evident even through the soil and debris that covered most of its surface. She brushed some of the leaves away with her hand and felt the edge of a stone that had been dressed smooth on its visible face. Old work. Skilled work. She stood and looked at the structure again, with this new information adjusting her understanding of it. Someone had put genuine effort into the foundation, said the gazebo itself had been built on top of something that was intended to last. She was not sure what to make of that distinction, but she stored it away as she stored most observations, without assigning it a meaning yet, letting it sit until the meaning found its own shape. She spent an hour there, moving carefully through the debris, noting things without touching most of them. The floor, where she could see it, appeared to be stone as well, or at least stone beneath whatever wooden decking had been added at some point and had subsequently rotted away. The walls of the foundation, where they were exposed, rose higher than she had initially realized, more than a foot above grade before the wooden structure began. This was not a slab. This was more like a short stone platform, deliberately raised, and with more height to it than a simple decorative garden structure would typically require. She did not know enough about construction to interpret these details with confidence. She knew only that they didn't match the rest of what she had assumed about the bequest. A neglected, worthless structure left to the family member who mattered least. That was the story the reading room had told, without words. But a stone foundation of this quality and this dimension told a different story, or at least asked a different question. She took photographs with her phone, working her way around the perimeter and documenting what she could see of the foundation from multiple angles. She noted the placement of the remaining posts, the way the floor level was higher toward the center of the structure, a slight elevation that she could feel with her feet even through the debris. She noted a section along the northern wall of the foundation where the stones appeared darker than the others, as though that face received different moisture or less sunlight, though neither explanation quite satisfied her when she considered the orientation. She drove home in the early evening with the gray sky having finally committed to a light rain that arrived without conviction. She thought about the foundation. She thought about Harold Beaumont, who had been a man of evident care and deliberation, who had spent his life on that land, who had known every corner of that property, the way people who stay in one place come to know things, not with the conscious awareness of learning, but with the absorbed familiarity of long presence. She thought about the fact that he had left her the gazebo specifically, not a portion of the savings, not a piece of the land that abutted the main property and might have been sold usefully, not the truck, the gazebo, the third of an acre at the southeastern corner where the trees had grown in and the structure had fallen, and nobody had thought to clear it or maintain it, or consider it as anything other than an eyesore that the property could absorb without particular notice. She did not know what Harold had intended. She suspected she would not know without more information than she currently had. But the foundation sat in her mind with the particular stubborn weight of a thing that does not match the frame around it, that requires a new frame before it can be seen clearly. She called her neighbor to thank her for watching Lily and found them both still awake. Lily deep in a project that involved construction paper and an amount of glue that the neighbor reported with the specific concern of someone who had underestimated a child's creative ambitions. She drove over to collect her daughter and carried her home half asleep and tucked her in and sat for a while at the kitchen table with the photographs on her phone arranged in a grid, looking at the stone foundation from 6 different angles in the quiet of the night. She made a decision that she did not articulate even to herself in full terms. She would go back. She would clear the debris. She would understand what the foundation was before she decided what the bequest meant. This was the rational version, the version she could justify without reference to anything as unreliable as feeling. She arranged the next 2 Saturdays in advance, shifting her shelf-stocking shift and making arrangements for Lily with the same neighbor, who accepted these requests with the good nature of someone who had watched Nora manage logistics under difficult conditions for long enough to understand that if she asked for something, it was because she genuinely needed it. She bought a pair of work gloves and a better pair of boots than the ones she had worn to the site. She put a heavy-duty utility bag in the trunk, along with a pruning saw she borrowed from the neighbor's garage, and a pry bar she found at the back of her own closet that she did not remember acquiring. She packed water and a lunch that she knew she would probably not stop to eat properly, and she drove south again the following Saturday with the particular focused quiet of someone who is committed to something before they have fully talked themselves into it. The site was exactly as she had left it. She had half expected otherwise, as though her interest in it might have prompted some change. But the fallen boards and the overgrowth and the persistent stone foundation were unchanged, indifferent to the week that had passed. She pulled on the gloves and started with the debris along the perimeter, working methodically, not rushing, taking stock before she moved anything. The vines came first. They had anchored themselves to the remaining posts and to the foundation stones with the commitment of plants that had never been asked to leave. She worked the saw and her hands alternately, pulling and cutting, clearing a working zone around the foundation's exterior before she attempted anything structural. The work was harder than she had anticipated. Her shoulders ached within the first hour, and she had underestimated the weight of the saturated debris that had been sitting at the base of the structure for what looked like at least a decade. But as she cleared, the foundation revealed itself more completely. The stones were uniform in a way she had not fully appreciated on her first visit. Not rough field stone, but dressed material, cut to consistent dimensions and laid with intentional horizontal courses. This was masonry work of a quality that spoke of professional construction, or, at minimum, of someone with significant skill and patience. So the mortar between the stones was old, but largely intact, indicating that the original work had been done correctly and had held against the years without the kind of repointing that most old stonework eventually required. She cleared the southern face of the foundation entirely by early afternoon and stood back to look at it with the direct eye of someone seeing a thing clearly for the first time. The foundation stood approximately 30 inches above grade at its highest point. It extended at least 16 feet across this face alone, which meant the total structure footprint was considerably larger than a simple garden gazebo had any practical reason to be. The walls were thick. She placed both palms against the face and felt the mass behind them, saw not the hollow suggestion of a decorative wall, but the solid resistance of significant depth. She ate her lunch sitting on a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, looking at the exposed stone. The afternoon light was better now, the clouds thinner, and the foundation's shadow fell across the disturbed ground in a long, clean line. She noticed, eating her sandwich and considering the wall, that the mortar in one section near the center of the southern face appeared different from the rest. Not in color exactly, but in texture. Slightly smoother, applied at a different time perhaps, or with a different mix. A repair, possibly, or a later addition to an older structure. She finished her lunch and went back to work. By the time the light began to soften toward late afternoon, she had cleared enough of the debris from around the foundation to walk the full perimeter without obstruction. What she found, doing so carefully and with full attention, was that the raised stone platform was not uniform in height. At the northwestern corner, where the debris had been deepest and the vegetation most dense, the foundation dropped below grade. Not by accident. The ground there had been shaped deliberately, creating a recessed area along that corner of the wall that was not visible from any of the approaches to the site. She crouched down and cleared the last of the accumulated leaf litter from this recessed section with her hands, working slowly. The stone face here was lower than the surrounding grade, as though a step had been cut into the earth approaching the foundation from this angle. She brushed away more debris, working carefully, and found the edge of a stone threshold. Not the floor of the gazebo above, but something at grade, something that ran parallel to the foundation wall and then disappeared into it. She stopped and looked at what her hands had uncovered. It was rectangular, approximately 3 feet wide and perhaps 4 feet tall, its top edge defined by a horizontal stone lintel that she had initially taken for part of the foundation coursework. She had walked past this corner twice on her earlier visit without recognizing what it was. It was not a wall, or rather, it was a wall with a door in it. The door itself was stone, or stone-faced, fitted so precisely into the opening that its edges were nearly invisible against the surrounding masonry. There was no handle, no visible hinge, no latch or lock in any conventional sense. There was only the seam, faint and deliberate, running in a rectangle against the face of the foundation. And at the lower right corner of that rectangle, a shaped depression in the stone surface, small enough that she had mistaken it for damage, that her fingers now recognized as intentional. A grip. Recessed into the stone like a secret kept in plain sight, waiting for someone who knew to look for it. She did not try to open it that afternoon. The light was going, and her hands were tired, and something in her understood that this was the kind of discovery that deserved more than an exhausted last effort. She covered the section again with some of the cleared debris, not concealing it exactly, but making it less obvious to a casual glance from the fence line. She stood there for a moment, but looking at the place where the door was hidden in its frame of old stone, and felt the particular sensation of standing at the edge of something without yet being able to see what it contained. She walked back to the car along the fence line in the fading light, moving through the evening silence of the field, with the photographs already loading on her phone, and her mind already working through the shape of what the following Saturday would need to involve. She had come with a pry bar and gloves, and the modest ambition of clearing enough debris to make a decision about a worthless piece of property. She drove north into the darkening evening with something different in her chest than what she had carried down. Not certainty. Certainty was a luxury she had never been able to afford comfortably, but something adjacent to it. The particular feeling of a person who is found in the middle of an ordinary effort, a question that the effort did not anticipate. A door in a foundation that had no reason to be there, a bequest from a careful man that had no apparent reason for its generosity, or its strangeness, or its silence. She passed the county line and merged onto the highway, and drove with both hands on the wheel through the spreading dark of a Saturday evening, the outline of a collapsed gazebo somewhere behind her, and a stone door somewhere in the middle of it, waiting with the patience of something that had been waiting a very long time already, indifferent to the week ahead, or the month, or the decade, belonging to no schedule except the one that had just, without ceremony or announcement, begun to move. She did not sleep well that night, or the night after it. Not because of anxiety exactly, though anxiety was present in the background the way it always was, a low and familiar frequency that she had learned to operate beneath without letting it dictate her actions. What kept her awake was something closer to the particular restlessness of a mind that has been given a problem it cannot set aside. She would close her eyes and find herself back at the foundation, at the recessed grip in the lower right corner of that rectangular seam, her fingers tracing the edges of something that did not belong in the narrative she had been handed. She looked at the photographs she had taken. She enlarged them on her phone screen and studied the stonework with the careful attention of someone trying to read a language they had never formally studied, but somehow recognized. The foundation was consistent in its coursework everywhere, except the section she had uncovered last, where the stones around the door frame were laid in a slightly different pattern. The horizontal courses interrupted by vertical elements that had a structural purpose she could not immediately name, but instinctively understood as intentional reinforcement. Whoever had built the door into the foundation had done so with the understanding that it needed to hold weight. Significant weight. She spent 2 evenings doing research she was not sure how to frame as a search. She looked up historic stone construction methods. She read about root cellars and cold storage vaults and the kinds of underground structures that landowners in the rural South had built over the course of 2 centuries, for reasons that ranged from food preservation to the more fraught histories that certain kinds of concealed spaces carried in that part of the country. She read about estate planning and the legal obligations of beneficiaries and what it meant to inherit land with existing structures on it. She was methodical about it, the same way she was methodical about everything, building a framework of information before she allowed herself to act within it. What she could not find, in any of the searches she ran, was a clear answer to the question she was actually asking, which was not what the structure might be, technically or historically, but what Harold Beaumont had known about it, and what he had intended for her to do with that knowledge. She called her cousin Diane on Thursday evening. Diane was not a close relative, but she was the family member most likely to have information about Harold without having an agenda attached to sharing it. She was in her mid-60s and had grown up in the county and had known Harold in the way that people who stay in the same place all their lives come to know each other, not as intimates exactly, but as fixtures, people whose characters were as legible as landmarks. Nora asked, as casually as she could manage, whether Harold had ever mentioned the southeastern corner of the property, whether anyone in the family knew what had originally been built there. Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she said that Harold had never been one to talk about his land in detail, that he had always regarded the particulars of the property as his own business in a way that was not unfriendly, but was very clear. She said that the gazebo had been on the property for as long as she could remember, that it had been built by Harold's father, or possibly his grandfather, she couldn't be certain. She said that when she was a child, she had once asked Harold whether she could play in the gazebo, and he had said no, quietly and without explanation, and that had been the end of it. He had not been unkind about it. He had simply been certain. Nora thanked her and moved the conversation to other things before ending the call. That detail settled into her like a stone dropped into still water. A child asking to play in the gazebo and being refused. Not because it was dangerous, which would have been the obvious answer. Simply no, and a certainty that foreclosed further questions. Harold had not been a man who forbade things casually. If he had kept the gazebo closed to visitors for his entire adult life, it was because the gazebo contained something that required keeping. She drove south the following Saturday, with a different preparation than the Saturdays before. She had borrowed a more powerful flashlight from the neighbor and bought a second one at the hardware store as a backup. She had put fresh batteries in both. She brought the pry bar again, and a small hand broom and a tape measure, and her phone charger in case she needed the camera for extended periods. She had packed more food and more water, enough for a full day. She wore layers against the morning cold, and brought an extra jacket for when the cold inevitably became something else. She told the neighbor only that she was returning to the property to continue clearing. She told Lily the same thing. Neither of them had reason to ask more than that, and she did not offer more than that, because she was still operating in the space between discovery and understanding. And she had learned that speaking about things before they were fully formed had a way of changing their shape in directions she couldn't predict or control. The drive was 4 hours of highway, and then 20 minutes of smaller roads that required more attention and produced a kind of quiet focus she found useful. She arrived at the property before 9 in the morning, the sky clear and cold, the light angling in low from the east across the flat sections of Harold's land. She picked up the key from the box Warren had installed on the gatepost, a development from the previous week that told her something about how Warren was thinking about the property now that it was his. She walked the fence line to the southeastern corner without stopping at the main house. She could see Warren's wife watching from the kitchen window as she crossed the field. The same window, the same expression, a consistency that Nora had decided to interpret as curiosity rather than hostility. The site was undisturbed. The debris she had placed over the door section was exactly as she had left it. She cleared it away carefully, revealing the stone seam again in the morning light. In this light, with the angle different from the previous week's late afternoon, the door was more visible than she had expected, the seam catching the low eastern light in a way that defined its edges with clean precision. She stood there, looking at it for a full minute, before she touched anything, because she understood that this was one of those moments whose texture she would carry for a long time, and she wanted to be present for it rather than rushing through it. She crouched and fit her fingers into the recessed grip. The stone was cold and slightly damp from the previous night's temperature drop. The grip was sized for a hand, not a tool, which meant the door had been designed to be opened by a person rather than with equipment. She pulled steadily, not hard, applying consistent pressure, but feeling for the resistance to tell her which direction the door was intended to move. It moved inward, not easily and not smoothly, but it moved. The seal between the door and the frame was tight in the way of something that had sat undisturbed for a considerable period. The dust and the slight settling of the earth, creating a friction that resisted the first pull and then released. The door swung inward on hinges she could not see, set into the frame in a way that concealed them entirely. The movement was controlled, the door balanced in a way that spoke of mechanical care beneath the stone facing. Cold air moved past her face as the opening appeared. Not the damp, stale air of a forgotten space. Not the smell of rot or moisture, or the particular underground mustiness she had been expecting. The air that came out was dry and cool, while carrying the neutral mineral scent of stone and nothing else. It smelled like a cathedral crypt or a cave that had never been wet, and the temperature of it against her face was a full 10 degrees colder than the morning air outside. She turned on the primary flashlight and angled it into the opening. A staircase. Stone steps, narrow but regular, descending at a steady grade into darkness that the flashlight illuminated in a narrowing cone. The walls on either side of the steps were stone, the same dressed material as the foundation exterior, and the ceiling above the steps was low, but not uncomfortably so. She could descend without crouching. The construction was deliberate and proportioned for use. She checked the door's swing range before she stepped inside, denoting that it would remain open on its own at the angle she had pushed it to. She wedged a stone from the cleared debris at the base of the frame as additional security, then stepped through the opening and onto the first step. The steps were 8 in number. She counted them as she descended, her hand on the wall for balance, the flashlight sweeping ahead and below. At the bottom, the staircase opened into a space that the flashlight could not immediately measure, its beam catching only what was directly in front of her before the darkness resumed on either side. She stood still and swept the light in a slow arc, left to right, letting her eyes adjust and her mind absorb the shape of what was there. The space was large, considerably larger than the footprint of the gazebo above would have suggested. It extended beyond the boundary of the foundation, she realized, which meant it had been excavated beneath the surrounding land as well, the gazebo's foundation serving as the entry structure rather than the full extent of what lay below. The ceiling was vaulted in a low arch, the stonework overhead as careful and as deliberate as everything else she had seen. The floor was stone, level, and swept clean in a way that was inconsistent with long abandonment. She moved the flashlight across the walls and stopped. The walls were lined with shelving, not rough wooden shelves, but fitted stone ledges, built into the walls in horizontal courses that ran from approximately knee height to above her head, along the entirety of the left and right walls. And on those shelves, arranged with a precision that matched everything else about the space, were objects, rows of them, covered in cloth that had once been a pale cream color and had aged to something darker, the covering still intact, still doing the work of protection they had been placed there to do. She did not touch anything immediately. She walked the full length of the space first, which took more steps than she had expected, confirming that the room extended at least 40 feet from the base of the stairs to the far wall. The shelving ran continuously along both side walls. The far wall had a different character, its surface covered not with shelving, but with a series of fitted wooden panels, dark with age, their grain visible even through the patina of decades. The panels were set into the stone wall in frames, suggesting that they concealed something behind them rather than serving as decoration. She went back to the shelving and crouched at the nearest covered object. She reached out and lifted the edge of the cloth. Beneath it was a wooden case, rectangular, approximately 2 feet long and 1 foot deep. Its surface darkened but intact, its lid secured with a small brass clasp that had oxidized to a deep brown but had not corroded through. She set the cloth aside and looked at the case for a moment. Then she lifted it from the shelf. It was heavier than she expected, significantly heavier. The weight of it shifted as she tilted it slightly, a settled, dense weight that did not roll or shift, but simply sat there as mass. She set it on the floor, crouched over it, and opened the clasp. The lid came up with minimal resistance. Inside, fitted into compartments lined with a dark velvet that had held its texture despite the years, were coins. Gold coins, she thought, though she was not certain of that word in any expert sense. They were the color of gold, the deep warm yellow of the real thing rather than the cooler brass yellow of imitation. And they were old, their faces worn smooth in places, but legible, bearing profiles and inscriptions. She could not read in the flashlight's beam without leaning very close. Each compartment held 2 coins, and there were 12 compartments in the case, 24 coins in a single box, their weight accounting fully for the heaviness she had felt when she lifted it. She sat back on her heels and breathed slowly. She replaced the lid without disturbing the coins and set the case carefully back on the shelf. She stood and looked at the length of the room. The shelving that ran the full length of both walls, floor to head height. So the covered objects arranged in rows, case after case after case, each one covered in the aging cloth, each one sitting on its stone ledge with the patient stillness of things that had been placed there with intention and left there with faith. She counted the visible rows on the nearest wall. 8 shelves, each running the full 40 feet of the room, each with objects spaced at approximately 20-inch intervals. She did not try to calculate the total in her head. The number that began to form was large enough that she stopped the calculation before it could fully assemble itself, because she needed to continue moving with the same methodical care she had applied to everything so far, and numbers of a certain size had a way of disrupting careful movement. She turned her attention to the wooden panels on the far wall. Now, there were 4 of them, each approximately 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall, set into the stone in recessed frames. She examined the edges of the nearest panel and found what she had begun to expect to find: a fitted grip, small and deliberate, concealed in the lower edge of the frame. She pulled it open. Behind the panel was a cavity in the wall, lined with stone and fitted with wooden shelving of a different character than the open shelves. Smaller compartments, divided by fitted wooden dividers, each compartment sized precisely for the objects it contained. These were flat cases, thinner than the coin boxes, covered in the same aged cloth. She opened the nearest one. Stamps, sheets of them, mounted on archival backing that had been fitted to the interior of the case with a precision that spoke of someone who understood what they were protecting. The colors were vivid despite the decades, the printing sharp. She could not read the denominations or the countries of origin without better light and more knowledge than she had, but the condition of what she was looking at was immaculate, in a way that she understood instinctively was significant. These were not the stamps of an ordinary collector. These were things that had been preserved with the specific intention of maintaining their full value, cared for by someone who knew exactly what they were worth and what conditions they required. She closed the panel and moved to the next one. Behind it were more cases, these ones narrower and taller, and each one standing upright in its compartment. She opened the nearest. Inside, protected by felt and held in place by fitted guides, were rolled documents. She could see the edges of what looked like certificates or bonds, the heavy paper slightly yellowed but intact, each roll sealed with a band of ribbon that had not been disturbed. She did not unroll them. She noted them and moved on. The third panel concealed a different kind of shelving arrangement, the compartments wider and deeper, each one lined with a padding material that had been fitted with care. Inside each compartment was a single object, wrapped separately in cloth that was thicker and finer than the material covering the open shelves. She unwrapped the nearest one with deliberate slowness, layer by layer, until the object inside was visible. It was a small painting, no larger than a piece of letter paper, its frame simple and dark, the painted surface extraordinary in the quality of its light, even in the beam of a flashlight. She could not have said who painted it, or when, or what it was worth in any specific sense. She was not equipped for that judgment. What she could say, holding it in her hands in the silence of the stone room, was that it was the work of someone who had known something about seeing the world that most people never learned. The light in the painted scene was alive in the way that distinguished certain objects from all the others around them, the quality that she had no technical word for, but that registered in the chest before it registered in the mind. She wrapped it carefully and replaced it in its compartment and closed the panel, while she stood in the center of the room and turned in a slow circle. She had been underground for perhaps 90 minutes. The flashlight was still strong. The air was still dry and cool and undisturbed. Around her, on shelves that ran the full length of a room, larger than any room in the house she rented, covered in cloth that had been placed there by hands she would never know, were the accumulated holdings of a man who had spent his entire life in one place and had apparently used that life to gather things of extraordinary and specific value, without telling a single person about any of it. She sat down on the bottom step of the staircase and let the flashlight rest in her lap, the beam pointing at the stone floor, the room around her dimly lit at its edges and full of shadow beyond the cone of light. She did not cry, which surprised her slightly, because she could feel something large and shapeless pressing against the inside of her chest that would have been easier to release than to hold. But she held it, because the moment had not arrived yet for that kind of response. Understanding came before feeling, in her experience, and understanding here would require more work than a single morning could provide. She climbed back up the stairs after another hour of careful documentation. She had photographed everything she could reach without disturbing the arrangement of the room. She had measured what she could measure and written notes in the small pad she had thought to bring at the last minute. She had tried to count, in a rough way, the number of cases on the open shelves, auto-arriving at a number that she set aside because it had not stopped growing even as she counted. She had not opened the fourth panel on the far wall, a decision she made deliberately, wanting to leave something for a subsequent visit when she could bring a better understanding of what she was looking at and what it required. She pulled the stone door closed behind her with the same care she had used to open it. It seated in its frame with a quiet finality. She replaced some of the cleared debris over the lower section. Not all of it. Not enough to fully conceal what she now knew was there, but enough to restore something like discretion to the corner of the foundation. She walked back to the car and sat in it for a long time without starting the engine. The field was quiet in the late morning light. A bird moved across the sky at the edge of the tree line and disappeared into the canopy. A distant mechanical sound from somewhere on the county road rose and faded. The world outside was proceeding with its ordinary operations, indifferent to what was happening in the southeastern corner of Harold Beaumont's property. She started the engine eventually. She drove to the nearest town, a 20-minute drive on roads she was beginning to know by feel, and found a diner on the main street where she ordered coffee and a meal she ate without tasting. She sat in the booth for a while after finishing, her hands around the coffee cup, working through what the next steps needed to be. She needed expertise. That was the first and clearest thing. She had photographs of objects she could not identify or value with any confidence, and she needed people who could. She needed to understand what the coins were, their age and origin and condition and value. She needed to know about the stamps, the documents, the paintings. She needed to know what the rolled certificates or bonds represented and whether they were still active instruments or historical artifacts. She needed, in short, to understand the full scope of what she had found before she could make any decision about what to do with it. She also needed to understand the legal situation. The bequest had been the gazebo and the land parcel on which it stood. Whether the underground structure fell within that bequest depended on definitions she was not qualified to interpret alone. The land and what it contained seemed like it should be straightforward, but she knew enough about the world to know that nothing involving significant value was ever straightforward without assistance. She called a number from her phone's contact list that she had saved 2 years ago and never used. An attorney she had met briefly at a community event, and who had given her a card with the specific instruction that she should call if she ever had a legal question she wasn't sure how to handle. She had kept the card because the woman had said it with a directness that made it sound like an actual offer rather than a social pleasantry. She had not had occasion to test that until now. The call went to voicemail. She left a careful message, specific enough to communicate that the matter was serious, vague enough not to say anything she was not ready to say in public. So she asked for a call back at the attorney's earliest convenience. She drove north in the early afternoon, the same highway she had traveled 6 times now in the past 3 weeks, but sitting differently in the seat this time, the weight of the drive altered by what she was carrying back with her that had not been there on any of the previous trips. She kept the radio off. She needed the quiet. The attorney called back before she reached the halfway point. She pulled over on the highway's shoulder and talked with the window partly down, the sound of passing traffic threading through the conversation in a way that made it feel more grounded than it might otherwise have. She described the situation in general terms: the inheritance, the structure, the discovery of additional spaces beneath the surface, the presence of objects she could not identify but believed to be of significant value. She asked what she needed to know. The attorney asked several careful questions in return. She had a quality of voice that suggested she was making notes rather than reacting, processing rather than performing, which Nora found immediately reassuring. They talked for 20 minutes. By the end of the call, she had a clear set of immediate steps and a meeting scheduled for the following Wednesday evening. She returned to the highway. The afternoon sun was dropping toward the western horizon, turning the flat sections of the countryside into long shadows and warm light. She thought about Harold Beaumont, about a man who had spent his life on a particular piece of land, or who had accumulated things of extraordinary value in a room beneath a garden structure that no one else was allowed to approach, who had left that structure and everything it contained to the family member that everyone else had most easily dismissed. She turned this over. The cousin who had received the savings account, the relative who had received the land sections with the best road access, Warren who had received the house and its contents. All of them people with established positions in the family's order of things, people whose receipts were legible and expected. And then her, the one who had driven 4 hours with a sleeping child in the back seat and had stood at the back of the reading room and received a bequest that had produced, from the assembled family, a sound that was not quite a laugh. She thought about the man who had refused to let a child play in the gazebo, who had maintained a stone room with vaulted ceilings and fitted shelving and humidity-controlled air for decades without telling anyone, who had organized his possessions with a care that was almost curatorial, each object protected, each case labeled in a system she had not yet decoded, each wall panel concealing a different category of things. She thought about whether he had known about her life specifically. The billing company and the grocery store and the rented house and Lily and the particular arithmetic of getting through each month. She could not know whether he had known any of that. But she thought about the fact that he had included her name in the document and no one else's alongside the southeastern corner of his land. And she thought about the foundation and the door and the stairs and the room below. And she thought that a man who had organized his possessions with that degree of care had probably also organized his intentions with a similar degree of care, She did not allow herself to calculate values. Not yet. The photographs were on her phone, and the phone was in the cup holder, and she did not open the photographs. She drove with her eyes on the road and her mind on the process of what came next, because the process was what she could control, and control was what she had always relied on when everything else was uncertain. She collected Lily from the neighbor's house at 6:30. Lily was in the middle of describing something that had happened with a classmate at school and transitioned seamlessly into this narrative as they walked home, not noticing or not requiring that her mother offer anything more than listening. Nora listened. She made dinner and listened to Lily talk about the classmate, and then about a book she was reading, and then about a question she had about how birds knew which direction to fly in winter. Nora answered the question as best she could, and when her best was not sufficient, they looked it up together on the phone with the photographs still unexamined in the camera roll below. That night, after Lily was asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and opened the photographs for the first time since she had taken them. She went through them one by one, slowly in the quiet of the house. The staircase, the vaulted ceiling, the shelving along both walls, the coin case open, the coins in their velvet compartments, the stamps in their archival cases, the rolled documents, the small painting wrapped in cloth and then unwrapped, the painted light alive even in the poor conditions of the flashlight photograph. She looked at each image for a long time. She was not looking for information she could extract with her current knowledge. She was simply looking, the way she had looked at the foundation after clearing the first face of debris, the way she had looked at the recessed grip before she used it, giving the thing its full reality before she tried to make it into something she could manage. The coins alone, 24 of them in a single case, and cases filling 2 walls of shelving for 40 feet. If even a fraction of them were what they appeared to be, the number was not something she had any personal reference for. The stamps, the paintings, and the documents she had not yet opened. The 4th panel she had not yet opened. All of it sitting in a stone room beneath 1/3 of an acre of land that a family of relatives had watched her receive with the communal understanding that she had been given the one piece of the estate that was worth the least. She set the phone face down on the table and finished her tea. She thought about the Wednesday meeting with the attorney. She thought about what expertise she would need, and how to find it, and how to approach it without drawing the kind of attention that would complicate things before she understood them clearly enough to manage the complications. She thought about the 4th panel and what might be behind it. She thought about a woman she had seen in the reading room at the estate, a cousin from the branch of the family that had always held themselves slightly apart from the rest, who had leaned toward her neighbor and whispered something when Nora's name was read, something that had produced a quiet, private smile in the neighbor and then been buried under the next announcement. She had noted it at the time without reacting. She noted it again now, in the kitchen, in the quiet of a house where her daughter slept in the next room, and she held the memory of it alongside the photographs on the darkened phone screen. She was not angry. Anger required energy that she had long since learned to apply more productively elsewhere. What she felt was something quieter than anger and more durable, the particular clarity of someone who has just understood something they had suspected for a long time without being able to prove it. Harold had known. Harold had seen something in her that the rest of them had not thought to look for, or had looked for and dismissed, which amounted to the same thing. He had spent decades watching his family operate according to its internal logic of who mattered and who didn't, and he had arrived at his own private conclusion, which he had expressed not in words, but in the architecture of a bequest that had made everyone in that room certain they understood the outcome, right up until the moment they didn't. She washed her cup and turned off the kitchen light and walked to the window that looked out over the narrow backyard of the rented house. She stood there for a moment in the dark, looking at nothing in particular, the ordinary dark of an ordinary neighborhood, the sounds of the street faint and indistinct beyond the glass. She turned away from the window and went to bed. The following Wednesday arrived with a cold front that had settled over the city since Monday, the kind of damp cold that accumulated in the bones rather than on the skin. She wore her good coat to the attorney's office, a gesture that was practical rather than performative, and arrived 5 minutes early and waited in the small reception area with a cup of water she had been given by the assistant and didn't drink. The attorney was a woman named Patricia Ansell, who was perhaps 50, with a quality of stillness that Nora associated with people who had learned that information was best received when the body did not interfere with the listening. She shook Nora's hand without comment on the coat or the drive or anything else that was not the matter at hand, and they sat down across a desk that held a legal pad, a pen, and nothing else. Nora described everything. She was precise and sequential, and did not use language that implied conclusions she had not yet verified. She described the bequest, the visits, the foundation, the stone door, the staircase, the room, the shelving, the cases, and the contents of the ones she had opened. She described the sealed documents and the paintings and the fourth panel she had not yet examined. She described the air quality and the temperature and the condition of the coverings and the organization of what was stored. Patricia Ansell listened without interrupting. She made notes at intervals, but did not look at her notes when she asked questions, which she did only after Nora had finished. The questions were specific and legally precise. She asked about the wording of the bequest in the will. She asked about the survey description of the land parcel and whether the parcel boundaries had been filed with the county. She asked about the construction of the underground structure and whether any permits or records existed for it that Nora was aware of. She asked about the presence of any other parties on the property at the time of the visits and whether Nora had communicated the discovery to anyone. Nora answered each question with the same precision she had used to describe the discovery. She had not told anyone. The land parcel and its boundaries had been described in the attorney's folder from the estate. The underground structure she could not speak to legally, though she had photographs that showed it was of significant age and had clearly been built as part of the original property development rather than as a later modification. Patricia Ansell said that the legal position was, in her initial assessment, more straightforward than it might appear. A bequest of land included what lay beneath the surface of that land, unless the will explicitly stated otherwise. And from what Nora had described, the will in question made no such limitation. The underground structure and its contents sat beneath the deeded land parcel and were, by all reasonable legal interpretation, part of what had been left to her. She said that she would need to review the full will documents before she could state this with formal confidence, and that there were steps that needed to be taken before the contents were moved, albeit appraised or disclosed, but that the preliminary picture was not complicated. Nora listened to this carefully. She asked about the family, about whether other beneficiaries had any potential claim, about what the process of legal confirmation looked like and how long it would take. The attorney said that without a specific competing claim in the will, and without an explicit exclusion of subterranean contents from the bequest, the position of other family members would be difficult to sustain legally. She said that the estate had been distributed and closed according to the will's terms, and that the bequest to Nora had been accepted by all parties at the time of the reading. She said these things with the measured certainty of someone who had navigated similar territory before and understood its topography. They talked for an hour. By the end of it, Nora had a list of specialists she needed to contact for authentication and appraisal, a legal framework for how to proceed with the contents of the room, and a clear understanding of the sequence of steps that would need to occur before any of the discovery became something other than private knowledge. She walked back to her car in the damp cold and sat for a moment before starting the engine. The city moved around her in the ordinary way of cities in the early evening, people and vehicles, and light. The world had not changed. It did not know to change. What had changed was somewhere south of there, in a stone room beneath a collapsed garden structure, in the dark and the cold and the dry air that had kept its contents exactly as Harold Beaumont had left them. She thought about the fourth panel, for the one she had not yet opened. She had held herself back from it deliberately, and she had understood even at the time that the reason was not caution, but something more like respect. The sense that some things needed to be approached correctly, that the sequence of revelation mattered, and that rushing it was a form of disrespect to the care with which it had been assembled. She would go back the following Saturday. She would bring the right people this time, or at least the first of them. The numismatic specialist whose name Patricia had given her, a woman who worked with historic coin collections and who had been recommended as both expert and discreet. She would open the fourth panel. She would begin to understand, in specific and verifiable terms, the full scope of what Harold Beaumont had spent a lifetime gathering in the stone room beneath the southeastern corner of his land. She started the engine and pulled into the evening traffic. She needed to collect Lily. She needed to make dinner and listen to whatever the current chapter of Lily's ongoing school narrative had produced that day. She needed to do the ordinary things that the day required of her, because the ordinary things were what kept the rest of it in proportion, and proportion was what had gotten her this far without braking. She merged onto the highway and drove toward home with the attorney's notes in her bag and the photographs on her phone and the particular steadiness of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been told, by someone who understands these matters, that the weight is real and it belongs to her. The Saturday ahead would tell her more. It would begin to put numbers to things that currently existed only as images and impressions. It would start the process of transformation from discovery to understanding, and from understanding to whatever came after understanding, which she was only beginning to allow herself to think about in any coherent way. The highway unspooled ahead of her in the headlights, familiar and purposeful, carrying her back toward the life she would maintain carefully until the life could change. She did not know yet how it would change. She did not allow herself to reach for that picture before it had earned the right to be seen. But she kept driving, as she always had, forward and steady, and without apology for the direction. The numismatist's name was Dr. Nevera Calloway, and she arrived at the property on a Saturday morning that was colder than any that had come before it, the kind of cold that made the air feel thin and bright, every surface sharp-edged in the low winter light. She was a woman in her early 60s, with the particular quality of someone who had spent decades in the presence of rare things without being altered by proximity into someone who showed off. She wore practical clothes and carried a case of tools that looked like a doctor's bag and spoke in complete sentences without embellishment, which Nora found immediately useful. They had spoken twice on the phone before meeting. Nora had been careful in those conversations, specific enough to be taken seriously, but not so specific as to be reckless. Dr. Calloway had asked the right questions in the right order, and had agreed to come with the directness of someone who recognized genuine inquiry and did not require it to be dressed up before she would respond to it. She had also agreed to the confidentiality terms that Patricia Ansel had advised, signing the document without complaint, which told Nora something important about her character. They drove the fence line together in Nora's car without speaking much. Dr. Calloway looked out the window at the land with the composed attention of a woman arriving somewhere she expected to be interesting. When they reached the southeastern corner and Nora began clearing the last of the debris from the stone door, the older woman crouched beside her without being asked and held the flashlight so the beam fell exactly where it was needed. The descent into the stone room was different with another person present, less solitary. The silence of the vaulted space pressed differently against two sets of ears, and the shelving along the walls looked different in the combined light of two flashlights, the coverage wider and more even, the full extent of the room's organization visible all at once, rather than revealed in the sweeping arc of a single beam. Dr. Calloway stood at the base of the stairs for a moment without speaking. Then she walked slowly to the nearest shelf and stood before the covered cases with her hands at her sides, and her eyes moving in the careful, methodical way of someone who understood that the first reading of a room was the one that could not be repeated. She did not reach for anything immediately. She walked the full length of the shelving on one side, would then cross to the other wall, and walked it in the opposite direction, completing the circuit at the base of the stairs again, where she turned and looked at Nora with an expression that hadn't changed from the composed attention she had worn since the drive down. She said that the organization was deliberate and consistent. She said this not as if she were offering it as information, but as if she were confirming a hypothesis she had formed before speaking it aloud. She asked whether anything had been disturbed since the initial discovery, and Nora said no, that she had replaced every case exactly where she had found it, and that nothing else had been touched. Dr. Calloway opened her bag and removed magnifying equipment and archival gloves and a small spectrometer that she explained in brief was used for non-invasive material analysis. Then she began with the coin cases nearest the staircase, working with the steady efficiency of someone for whom expert examination was as natural as breathing. She opened the first case Nora had opened on her initial visit and studied each of the 24 coins in sequence. The magnifier held steady, her notes accumulating in a small pad with the compressed handwriting of someone who had developed a personal shorthand over many years of field work. Nora sat on the bottom step and watched without speaking. She had learned in the previous weeks that the most useful thing she could offer in situations where expertise was being applied was the space in which to apply it. Dr. Calloway worked for 3 hours on the coin cases before she said anything substantive. The room was cold enough that both of them had kept their coats on throughout, and Nora had long since lost feeling in her feet, despite the thick socks she had worn in anticipation. But the cold had a quality she had come to associate with the room by now. A clean, dry, preserving cold that belonged in the space the way silence belonged in a library. It was part of the mechanism. When Dr. Calloway finally spoke at length, she did so without preamble, standing with one of the coin cases open before her and her notes on the shelf beside it. The coins were from multiple periods and multiple countries of origin. There were American gold eagles from the late 19th century, several of them in conditions she described with technical terms that Nora recorded phonetically in her own pad without pretending to understand their full implications yet. There were pre-revolutionary French gold coins and a series of British sovereigns that ranged across nearly a century of minting. There were coins she identified as Ottoman Empire. Gold pieces of a specific period, and two she said required additional verification, but which she believed to be among the rarest variants of their type known to exist in private hands. She said the condition across the collection was exceptional in a way that was not accidental. Someone had understood the specific environmental requirements for long-term coin preservation and had engineered the room to meet them. The consistent temperature, the low humidity, the absence of light, the fitted cases lined with the right archival materials. This was not a collection that had survived by luck. It had been maintained by design. She moved to the panel compartments then, the stamps and the rolled documents and the paintings. She worked through the stamps with a focus that sharpened visibly as she progressed, her movements becoming more deliberate rather than less as the significance of what she was examining accumulated. She identified several sheets as among the highest value items in their respective categories, including a block of stamps from a printing that had been considered entirely destroyed and was therefore known to exist only in institutional collections. She said this last part quietly, almost to herself, as if still arriving at the conclusion while speaking it. The rolled documents she handled with particular care, unrolling each one part way to establish its nature before re-securing it. Several were bearer bonds from the mid-20th century, she said, still active instruments drawn on institutions that had merged, but whose obligations had been assumed by successor entities. The face values printed on them were large. She read some of them aloud, not dramatically, but because accurate documentation required it, and each number landed in the quiet of the stone room without echo, absorbed by the vaulted walls the way everything in the room was absorbed, with the patient impartiality of a space that had been holding things for a very long time, without passing judgment on their significance. Nora wrote down each figure as it was read. The paintings, 8 of them in the third panel, she examined for the longest period of any single category. She used the spectrometer carefully on each one, noting the readings without explanation until she had completed the full set, after which she stood back and looked at them arrayed on the shelf where she had laid them for easier examination, 8 small paintings in a row, and said that she would need laboratory confirmation before she could be definitive about attribution. But that her preliminary assessment was that at least 3 of them were original works by artists whose names, when she said them, were ones Nora recognized without being able to place them immediately in any specific context. The recognition was enough. These were not unknown names. They ate lunch at the top of the stairs, with the stone door propped open, sitting in the entrance to the underground room, with the cold field stretching out behind them and the vaulted ceiling visible below. Dr. Calloway ate a sandwich with the same composed efficiency she brought to everything, and offered Nora a second opinion on the bond valuation methodology she had been using in her notes. Nora ate and listened and added to her own notes. The conversation was practical and specific and oddly comfortable. Two women at the edge of a discovery that neither of them had sought, but both of them were taking seriously. After lunch, Nora led her to the fourth panel. She had thought about this moment many times in the preceding weeks. She had held the fourth panel back deliberately through 2 full visits to the room, and she had not been entirely sure herself why. Standing before it now with Dr. Calloway beside her, and the flashlights casting their double coverage across the stone wall, she understood the reason more clearly. She had known, without being able to prove it, that the fourth panel would be different from the others. That Harold had organized things in a sequence, and that the sequence ended here, at the far right corner of the far wall, at the last panel, the one she had saved. She found the grip and pulled it open. Behind it was not shelving. The cavity behind the fourth panel was deeper than the others, its interior lined not with wooden dividers, but with a fitted metal framework, bolted to the stone in a way that suggested it had been installed after the initial construction of the room rather than built into it from the beginning. The metal was clean, showing no corrosion despite the age of the surrounding structure. Within the framework, held in place by fitted brackets, were metal containers, cylindrical tubes of a gauge and length that Nora did not immediately recognize, but that Dr. Calloway, standing beside her, identified without hesitation as archival map tubes of a specific professional specification, the kind used for long-term storage of documents too large for standard cases. There were 14 of them, each sealed at both ends with fitted caps that had been wrapped in archival tape. And between the tubes, fitted into the remaining spaces in the metal framework, were 3 items that were not tubes. They were leather portfolios, old and dark, each one secured with a strap and buckle that had stiffened with age, but had not failed. And beneath the portfolios, in a fitted recess at the bottom of the framework, a metal document box, rectangular, its surface unadorned, its lid secured with a lock that still held a key in it. Dr. Calloway photographed everything before Nora touched any of it. Then Nora removed the key from the lock and opened the metal box. Inside was a letter, handwritten in a script she did not recognize as Harold's, but would later be confirmed as his in earlier life, the handwriting of a younger man than the one she had known. The letter was dated and addressed to no one by name, which she understood was intentional, and it was written in the direct and unembellished language of a person who had made peace with the specific things they wanted to say. Harold wrote that the room had been built by his father and his father's father together over 3 years, so on the southeastern corner of the property that had been chosen for its soil composition and its distance from the main house's foundation. He wrote that the collection had been assembled over 4 generations, beginning with items that had been passed down through the family from a period before the Civil War and expanded by each successive generation with deliberate intent. He wrote that the collection had never been registered with any institution or insurer, and that this had been a choice made consciously to protect it from the various kinds of attention that registration invited. He wrote that the contents of the room had been maintained according to the standards that each generation had refined and passed along, and that by the time the letter was written, the room had held its contents through 3/4 of a century without loss. He wrote about why he was leaving it the way he was leaving it. He did not use emotional language. He used the language of observation. He wrote that he had watched his family for a long time and that he had noticed certain things. Among them, the way that people who already had enough tended to assume that having enough made them better judges of what things were worth. He wrote that in his experience, the people who understood the real value of things were not usually the people who expected to receive them. He wrote her name. It was the only name in the letter. He wrote it plainly, in the middle of a paragraph that was otherwise unaddressed, and the fact of seeing it there in the handwriting of a dead man in a stone room beneath a collapsed garden structure was the thing that finally undid the composure she had maintained for 3 weeks, and 2 visits, and a legal consultation, and 3 hours of cold beside an expert in coins. She did not cry loudly or for long. Dr. Calloway stood nearby and said nothing, and did not look away, which was the right response, and the one that allowed Nora to finish and return to herself without feeling that the moment had been witnessed in a way that diminished it. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the metal box and closed the lid. They worked through the rest of the 4th panel's contents methodically. The map tubes contained property surveys and architectural drawings that Dr. Calloway identified as potentially significant for establishing the legal history of the underground structure. The leather portfolios held correspondence and provenance documents for significant portions of the coin and stamp collection, the kind of accompanying record that transformed objects of unknown origin into objects with verifiable histories. This was, Dr. Calloway said with the closest thing to emphasis, she had used all day. The part of the collection that would most dramatically affect the final valuation, because provenance was not simply a legal nicety, but a substantial portion of monetary value in categories like this one. They left the room in the late afternoon, closing the stone door with the care that Nora had applied every time, and walked back to the car through the long shadows of the winter field. Dr. Calloway's notes filled 22 pages of her small pad. Nora's own notes filled 14. They sat in the car with the heat running and went through the numbers together, not as a final calculation, but as a working estimate, category by category, using the conservative ends of the ranges Dr. Calloway had established for each type of item. The number, when Dr. Calloway wrote it at the bottom of the last page and showed it to Nora, was $291 million. She said it was conservative. She said that laboratory confirmation of the painting attributions and full authentication of several of the coin variants could add to that figure significantly. She said that the bearer bonds, if all were confirmed active, I added a portion she had held to a conservative face value, and that the actual redeemable amount might exceed her estimate. She said all of this in the same measured tone she had used for everything, because for Dr. Vera Calloway, the number was a professional finding, the result of expertise correctly applied. For Nora, sitting in the driver's seat of a car parked beside a fence line in a county 4 hours from her rented house, the number was something else entirely. It was the distance between everything she had ever known and something she did not yet have the vocabulary for. It was Lily's shoes and the February heating bill and the grocery store shelf-stocking shift and the billing company desk and the morning she had sat at the kitchen table looking at a number in a checking account and had required careful optimism to interpret it as stability. It was all of those things simultaneously, and it was none of them, because it made all of them into the past. The distance between what had been and what would be, measured not in miles or years, but in the length of a stone staircase, descending into a vaulted room that a family had built and tended and kept silent about for nearly a century, and then left to her. She thanked Dr. Calloway with a directness that she hoped communicated the full weight of the gratitude without requiring her to attempt language she did not currently have. So Calloway shook her hand and said that it had been the most significant appraisal of her career, and that she would have the preliminary written report prepared within 10 days. Then she got into her own car and drove down the gravel road without looking back, which was, Nora thought, exactly the right thing to do. The legal process that followed was not fast. Patricia Ansell had prepared her for that, and the preparation was useful, because patience under these specific conditions required a kind of discipline that was different from the patience she had applied to everything else. This waiting had a different texture. It was waiting for something that was already true to become something that was formally and legally recognized as true, which was not the same as waiting for an outcome to be determined. The outcome was determined. The paperwork was catching up to it. There were assessors and estate attorneys and authentication specialists and a forensic accountant that Patricia brought in to establish the full legal framework for the discovery. There were county records to be searched and surveys to be confirmed, and the provenance documents from the leather portfolios to be formally authenticated, a process that took most of the winter and produced results that aligned almost exactly with Dr. Calloway's conservative estimates. The paintings were authenticated in February by a laboratory that confirmed 2 attributions and elevated a third to a category of significance that required Patricia to revise the total valuation upward for the 3rd time. The bearer bonds were confirmed active through a process that involved 4 separate financial institutions and took 6 weeks and produced more paperwork than everything else combined. The rare coin variants that Dr. Calloway had flagged for additional verification were examined by 2 independent specialists whose findings agreed with each other and exceeded her estimate in one case by a margin that was not trivial. The final confirmed valuation landed 11 cents above $291 million. Patricia read this to her over the phone on a Tuesday afternoon in March, while Nora was sitting at the billing company desk, working through a stack of resubmissions, and the precision of that 11 cents, the accidental specificity of it, struck her as so genuinely absurd in relation to the enormity of the surrounding number that she had to press her lips together and look at the ceiling for a moment before she could continue the conversation. Word reached the family before Nora intended it to. These things rarely happened on the schedule of the person who had the most reason to control the timing. Patricia had been careful, and Nora had been careful. But careful had limits when the process involved multiple institutions and specialists and county record searches, each one a small point of potential leak into the connected world of a county where people knew each other and talked and noticed when something unusual was happening at the southeastern corner of the Beaumont property. She heard it had begun when Warren's wife mentioned to a neighbor that there had been activity along the fence line for several months, and that Nora had been bringing people with equipment cases to the property. From there, it had traveled in the way that information travels in small communities, not through a single clear channel, but through the ambient network of proximity and curiosity, and the human tendency to complete a partial story with the most interesting available explanation. By the time the estate valuations were formally filed with the county, which was a public record, the family had already assembled a version of the story that was mostly accurate and significantly too late for anyone to do anything about. The calls came in clusters. Some were careful and formal, a relative she barely knew asking polite questions framed in the language of family concern. Some were less careful. The cousin named Dale, who had received the generous share of the savings account and had told her at the reading to look on the bright side, left a message that began with a greeting so cordial it required a full minute before it arrived at the point, which was that he had always believed Harold had intended the family to benefit collectively from his estate, and that he hoped she would keep that spirit in mind as things developed. She did not return that call. There was a formal inquiry from Warren, submitted through his own attorney, questioning whether the underground structure had been part of the land parcel, as described in the will, or whether it represented a separate category of property that should have been distributed differently. Patricia addressed this within 2 weeks, with documentation that was thorough enough that no subsequent challenge was filed. Constance, the older woman who had touched her arm at the reading with genuine gentleness and told her that Harold was a strange man about things, called without an agenda. She called simply to say that she had heard what had been found and that she was glad it had been found by Nora, and that she had always thought Harold was a man who knew what he was doing even when the rest of the family couldn't see the logic of it. She did not ask for anything. She wished Nora well and ended the call without lingering. In that call, the only one without a subtext, was the one Nora replayed most often in the weeks that followed. She told Lily on a Sunday evening in March, sitting at the kitchen table that had held so many calculations and cups of tea and midnight moments of careful optimism. She told her plainly and in age-appropriate terms. She said that great-great-uncle Harold had left them something very valuable inside the gazebo he had left her, and that because of it, their life was going to be able to change in ways they hadn't been able to plan for before. Lily listened with the seriousness she brought to most things. She asked whether they would have to move. Nora said they would be able to choose whether to move, which was different. Lily considered this distinction with a thoughtfulness that was entirely characteristic. Then she asked whether they could get a dog. Nora laughed, a full and genuine laugh that came up from somewhere deep and surprised her with how good it felt, and said yes. They could get a dog. Lily went back to her book, and Nora sat at the table a little longer, the kitchen light warm above her, the ordinary sounds of the neighborhood outside, and let herself be where she was for a few minutes, without moving toward the next thing. The months that followed contained the particular work of transformation done correctly, which was slower and more deliberate than the world tended to imagine when it thought about sudden wealth. She did not move immediately. She paid off the debts first, quietly and completely. The way she had always managed financial obligations, without ceremony but without delay. She found a financial advisor who had been recommended by Patricia and who spent 3 sessions asking her questions before offering any recommendations, which told her everything she needed to know about whether to trust the recommendations. She left the billing company in June, not dramatically, not with a speech or a statement. She gave proper notice and completed her projects, and shook hands with her supervisor and walked out on her last day with the same quiet self-possession she had walked in with for the previous 4 years. The shelf-stocking shift she had ended quietly 2 months earlier, thanking the manager in person on her last night, meaning it, because the work had been what it was supposed to be, honest and necessary, and she had no interest in rewriting the meaning of it now that it was over. And she bought a house in the spring. Not extravagant, not a statement. A house with a garden and enough rooms and a yard that was large enough for a dog to operate in without feeling constrained. It was in a neighborhood where the lawns were maintained, and the gutters were clear, and the walls didn't let the wind through in winter. She stood in the empty living room on the first day she owned it, and looked at the light coming through the windows, the clean and unobstructed light of a house that was entirely hers, and felt the specific satisfaction of a thing that had been worked toward rather than received, even though the receiving had been real and the work had not been the conventional kind. Lily started at a new school in the fall, one with resources and small classes, and a teacher who used the word bright as a matter of course because it was a place that had the luxury of noticing. She adapted with the particular adaptability of a child who had always understood, without being told, that change was not the same as loss. The southeastern corner of Harold's property she returned to once more in the autumn of that year, after the legal process was fully complete, and the contents of the stone room had been professionally cataloged and removed under supervised conditions and transferred to secure storage, while the longer process of sale and disposition unfolded. She walked the fence line alone on a morning that was cold and clear, the same cold and clear of the morning she had first come here with Dr. Calloway, and stood at the corner where the stone door sat in its frame. The debris had been fully cleared now, as part of the documentation and removal process. The door was visible, unambiguous in the morning light. The foundation stones rose clean and dressed and deliberate from the disturbed earth of the clearing. All the years of overgrowth removed, the structure revealed as what it had always been. Not the remains of a garden feature. The entrance to something built with intention, maintained with care, kept silent with purpose. She placed her hand flat against the stone face of the foundation. The same cold she had felt on the first morning she had touched it, biting and mineral and entirely itself. The stone did not feel different for what it had held. It had no opinion about its history and no interest in its significance. It was simply what it was, old and well-made, and still standing. She thought about Harold. She thought about him often, in the way that you thought about people who had altered the direction of your life, without being present for the alteration, without being able to witness what their decision had produced. She thought about a man who had spent 83 years on a piece of land, who had built and tended and kept silent, who had watched his family operate according to its own logic and had arrived at his own private conclusion about where the real capacity for stewardship lived, who had written her name in the middle of a letter in a room 4 stories beneath a garden structure and left it there, waiting. She did not know what he had seen in her. She could guess. The particular quality that the people with the most resources tended to overlook in the people with the fewest. Not ambition, not luck, not the obvious markers of potential that required comfortable circumstances to become visible. What Harold had seen was probably something simpler and harder to quantify. The willingness to show up, to do the work, to stand at the edge of something without immediately knowing what it was, and to choose to understand it rather than dismiss it. She had done that. Not heroically, not with any awareness at the time that something was being tested, simply because showing up and doing the work was what she knew how to do. It was what she had always done. The only difference was that this time, what she had shown up for had been something other than what she had been told it was. She removed her hand from the stone and stood in the autumn morning for another minute. The bare cleared foundation around her, the tree line dark at the edge of the field, the sky pale and enormous above the flat southern land. A crow moved across that sky without hurrying, its path direct and certain, knowing where it was going in the way that creatures who navigate by instinct rather than plan always seem to know. She turned and walked back along the fence line toward the car. The gravel road was the same gravel road it had always been. The county had not paved it. Perhaps it never would. Some roads stayed what they were regardless of what happened at the end of them. She drove north on the highway that she had traveled so many times now that it had become a part of her. Its particular sequence of exits and overpasses, and the way the landscape shifted from southern flatness to the hills of the middle distance. She drove with both hands on the wheel in the early afternoon light, the same posture she had maintained on every drive before, careful and present, not rushing toward what was ahead, and not looking back at what was behind. Lily was at school. There was a dog at home, a large, unhurried animal named Harold, which had been Lily's suggestion, and which Nora had agreed to without comment, understanding that the name was Lily's way of acknowledging something she had not been fully told, but had, in the particular way of perceptive children, mostly worked out for herself. The highway opened ahead of her, clear and familiar. She settled into it. The life she was returning to was not the one she had left 4 hours south of there on the October morning of the will reading, the morning when a room full of relatives had received their bequests and turned their attention toward her with the comfortable certainty of people who already knew what the outcome of a thing would be. That certainty had been wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not wrong in a way that required anyone to be confronted or corrected. Simply wrong in the ordinary and irreversible way that assumptions tend to be wrong when they are built on an incomplete understanding of what something is worth. She had not sought vindication. She had sought understanding. The distinction mattered to her, and she had maintained it throughout. In every meeting, and every phone call, and every morning she had driven 4 hours to stand in a field and do the work that needed doing. Vindication was what happened to other people's certainty when it met reality. It was a byproduct, not a purpose. What she had sought and what she had found was the thing Harold had trusted her to find. Not just the room and its contents. The confirmation that overlooked things retained their value whether or not anyone was looking. That careful work done in the right direction produced results that even the people most certain of the outcome could not anticipate. That the southeastern corner of a man's life, the part everyone else had walked past without curiosity, the part that had been handed to the wrong person with a sound that was not quite a laugh, had been, all along, the part that contained the most. She took the last exit before the city and followed the familiar roads toward home. The light was changing as it did in autumn, the golden late afternoon quality of it sitting on the ordinary surfaces of the neighborhood, with a warmth that made everything look briefly important. The lawns and the parked cars and the gutters that were clear now, because she had cleared them herself last weekend, standing on the aluminum ladder she had bought with the specific pleasure of buying a thing for a house that was hers. She pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment with the engine quiet, the familiar sound of the neighborhood settling around her. From inside the house came the low and patient sound of Harold the dog, who had learned the specific sound of her car's engine and always announced her return with the same steady certainty, as though her arriving home was the one thing in the world he had never doubted. She got out of the car, picked up her bag, and walked to the front door. The key in her hand was hers. The lock it opened was hers. The house beyond it, and the dog, and the light inside, and the room prepared for the daughter who would come home from school in an hour and drop her bag in the hall and ask about dinner before she had even taken her jacket off. All of it was hers. She opened the door and went inside. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.